We meet Iris, a mother deeply mourning the recent loss of her young son, Mateo. The tragedy occurred during a family hiking trip in a California state park, where Mateo suffered a fatal fall. This devastating event has left Iris engulfed in grief and guilt, straining her relationship with her husband, who remains unaware of the depth of her sorrow. One early morning, Iris quietly leaves her home, careful not to disturb her sleeping husband, and drives to the state park that holds the painful memories of her son's death. She carries with her Mateo's cherished toy boat, intending to place it at a makeshift memorial she has created at the base of a tree near the cliff where the accident occurred. This spot has become a sacred place for her, a site where she confronts her overwhelming sense of loss. As Iris stands at the cliff's edge, the weight of her grief becomes almost unbearable. She contemplates ending her life at the very location where her son died, seeing it as a way to escape her pain and perhaps reunite with Mateo. At this critical juncture, a man named Richard approaches her. He appears to be a fellow hiker and engages her in conversation, expressing concern for her well-being. Richard shares his own story of personal loss, recounting a tragic event from his past that led him to a similar point of despair. His words resonate with Iris, and she feels a connection with this stranger who seems to understand her suffering. Moved by Richard's empathy and persuaded by his arguments against her self-deleting, Iris decides to step back from the brink. She agrees to walk back with him to the parking area, feeling a glimmer of hope and a sense of companionship in her darkest moment. However, upon reaching their vehicles, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. Richard's demeanor changes from compassionate to menacing. Without warning, he attacks Iris with a stun device, incapacitating her. He swiftly restrains her wrists and ankles with zip ties, rendering her unable to move or call for help. Richard then places her in the back of his car, transforming from a sympathetic stranger into a captor with alarming speed. A couple of minutes later, Iris regains consciousness and the initial shock wears off. She realizes the gravity of her situation. She is trapped in a moving vehicle with a man who has assaulted and abducted her. Summoning her inner strength, Iris manages to free her hands from the zip ties. In a desperate bid for freedom, she attacks Richard while the car is still in motion. During the struggle, she discovers a syringe and realizes that Richard has injected her with a paralyzing agent. The horrifying truth dawns on her: the drug is gradually taking effect, and she has limited time before complete paralysis sets in. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline and the instinct to survive, Iris fights through the encroaching numbness. She manages to escape from the vehicle and flees into the dense forest that surrounds the park. The terrain is rugged, and every step becomes increasingly challenging as the paralytic agent spreads through her system. Her movements grow sluggish, and she struggles to maintain control over her own body. The forest, which once symbolized her grief, now becomes a labyrinth of survival, with Richard pursuing her relentlessly. As Iris drags herself deeper into the forest, every movement feels agonizing. The paralytic agent courses through her body, making it harder to move. Desperate to evade Richard, she crawls toward a fallen tree, forcing herself underneath it. The rough bark scrapes against her skin, but she doesn't care. She just needs to stay hidden. Her breathing is uneven as she listens for Richard's footsteps crunching through the leaves. He's close. She presses her face against the damp earth, trying to remain as silent as possible. But then, she feels something tickling her cheek. Ants skitter across her skin. A single ant crawls into her nostril. The sensation is unbearable. Panic takes over. Iris jerks her head and lets out a muffled scream. In an instant, she scrambles out from under the tree, dragging herself across the dirt. Her body is failing, but the instinct to survive keeps her moving. Richard hears her. His footsteps shift direction, coming straight toward her. Using every last bit of energy, she drags herself toward a nearby river, rolling down the muddy slope and into the cold current. The water engulfs her, shocking her system. She lets the current take her, arms weakly flailing as she drifts away. The river carries her far enough that Richard loses sight of her. After what feels like forever, she sees an overhanging branch. Summoning the last of her strength, she reaches for it and grips it tightly. She pulls herself out of the water and onto the bank. Her body is trembling, her skin covered in scratches, mud, and bruises. The effects of the drug are worsening. She collapses onto the damp grass, her breath shallow. She rolls onto her side, trying to keep herself awake, but every blink feels heavier. Suddenly, the distant sound of a lawnmower hums through the forest. It's coming closer. Iris's heart pounds in her chest. If she can just make some kind of noise, anything. But she can't even lift her head. The vibration of the mower grows louder. The machine sputters to a stop. The man pushing it steps forward, confused by the sight of a woman lying in the grass. He kneels beside her, gently turning her onto her back. His rough fingers trail across her face, testing for any sign of consciousness. He speaks to her, asking if she can hear him. Iris focuses with everything she has left and blinks once. For yes. Relief washes over the man as he realizes she's alive, but something is very wrong. The man wastes no time. He carefully lifts her into a wheelbarrow, grunting from the effort, and wheels her toward his home. When they arrive at the small house, he puts her in the kitchen and rushes to grab his phone. Just as he begins dialing the sheriff's department, there's a knock at the door. He hesitates, glancing back at Iris, who is frantically blinking at him, trying to communicate something. The man furrows his brows, unsure of what she's trying to say. He sets the phone down and walks to the door. When he opens it, Richard is standing outside. His face is streaked with dirt and sweat, his expression a careful mix of concern and desperation. He introduces himself, claiming that he's looking for his wife. He explains that they were in a terrible car accident, and she wandered off in a dazed state. The man doesn't respond right away. Something about Richard seems off. He tells Richard to wait outside while he calls for help. But Richard steps inside. He moves slowly, looking around, eyes sweeping over the room. The man tenses, realizing he may have made a mistake letting him in. Richard takes a seat on the couch, sighing deeply. He asks to borrow a phone, claiming he lost his during the accident. But the man isn't buying it. He insists that Richard needs to leave. That's when Richard changes his approach. His shoulders slump, and his voice lowers as he speaks with fake vulnerability. He confesses that his wife, Iris, has been struggling with mental health issues ever since their son died. He claims that if the authorities take her, she'll be institutionalized, and he'll lose her forever. His eyes are wet, his hands trembling slightly. Behind the couch, Iris listens, helpless, rage bubbling inside her, but she can't do anything. Richard subtly changes the conversation, asking the man about his own life. The man hesitates before revealing that his wife passed away from a heart attack some time ago. The loss still lingers in his voice. Feeling a connection, the man considers telling Richard the truth, that Iris is right here. But before he can speak, Richard's phone rings. The man's eyes narrow. As Richard said, he lost his phone. A cold realization sinks in. Richard has been lying. Richard senses the shift in energy. He straightens, his false sorrow fading. The man demands that he leave immediately. But Richard doesn't move. Instead, he demands to know where Iris is. The man, stalling for time, says she's in the shed. Richard doesn't believe him. He steps closer, his body tense. The man pushes him and two men grapple, knocking over furniture as they struggle for control. He reaches for something, anything, and his hand finds a knife. The blade plunges into his leg. He cries out, and the fight turns desperate. Richard plunges the knife into his stomach. Richard straightens and looks around the house, eyes landing on the shed. He throws the door open, but it's empty. Frustrated, he grabs a gas can and begins pouring fuel over the furniture, the floor and the dead man's body. He lights a match. Flames begin to spread. Iris watches in horror. She's still trapped, her body useless. Desperate, she forces her fingers to move. With everything she has left, she grips the window blind and pulls it open, then lets it snap shut. The sight catches Richard's attention. He goes back into the house and picks up Iris' limp body, and carries her out of the burning house. He places her in the truck and they drive away. While on the road, Richard lets out a humorless chuckle before shaking his head. He mutters that he never killed a man before, then turns his head slightly, glancing at Iris, who lies motionless in the passenger seat. Iris stares blankly ahead, unable to respond. After a while, they pull up to a small gas station. Richard shifts the truck into park and sighs before reaching for an old baseball cap and places it on Iris' head. He gets out, stretching his arms before walking toward the store. The second he disappears inside, Iris' mind races. She wonders how she can get someone's attention when her body still won't respond the way she needs it to. Even her fingers barely move. A sudden noise pulls her attention, a vehicle pulling into the gas station. The sound of doors opening. A small boy, no older than 12, hops out of the back seat and runs toward the truck. He stops right outside Iris' window, peering inside. Their eyes meet. Richard exits the store just as the woman and her son drive away. He walks to the pump, fills the truck with gas, then gets back inside. He doesn't say another word as they drive away. Later, they pull up to a lake, and Richard gets out, grabbing his knife from the back. He yanks open the passenger door and drags Iris onto the boat. He paddles to the center of the lake, the oars slicing through the water. The realization hits her like a brick, he's going to drown her. Panic surges through her, but then she sees something. Richard's gun. An idea forms. Desperate, She swallows hard and musters the most pitiful voice she can manage. She tells him that her son's toy is in her pocket, and she wants to hold it before he does this. Richard leans over, reaching into her pocket. That's when she strikes. With the last of her strength, she grabs the knife and slashes his face. He loses balance and tumbles into the water. Iris doesn't waste time. She lunges for the gun, struggling as her fingers barely cooperate. A gunshot and Iris manages to kill him. Suddenly, water fills the floor, spilling over. Iris tries to move, but her body isn't fully responsive yet. The boat sinks lower, and she has no choice. With one final effort, she throws herself into the lake. The cold shocks her, but her limbs are working again. She swims, lungs burning, until her feet touch the shore. Suddenly, she sees Richard dragging himself out of the water, barely alive. Iris limps toward him, exhausted but determined. She watches him struggle, his breath ragged. He looks up at her, eyes filled with hatred, but before he can speak, she kneels on him and thanks him for showing her how precious life is, and walks away, leaving him dying.